Whew! Well, now that that's over with, let's all just take a moment, breathe, and just exist in the stillness. Deep breath in, and then scream for joy. Woohoo! Trump is gone! Okay, you good? Because we still have a lot of shit to do. Donald Trump is officially no longer the President of the United States, but he leaves behind a lot of damage that needs to be repaired, plus the serious, long-standing social problems that preceded him and, in many cases, enabled his rise to power are still there, with Democrats controlling the presidency in both houses of Congress for at least the next 2 years. We're facing an interval where we might be able to make a tiny bit of progress. But for that to happen, we need to, make the progress. That's the whole point of this series of videos, to examine problems in American society that need to be addressed and to hopefully prompt some thought as to how we go about addressing those problems in practical ways. One of the strongest, most effective tools we have to respond to large-scale social problems is the government. As a progressive, I think dealing with large-scale social problems that affect the quality of life of millions of people, is one of the government's most important jobs. I'm talking about problems like homelessness and mass incarceration, which I've discussed in previous videos, as well as problems like police brutality, income inequality, and wealth disparity, limited access to health care and education, and other topics I'll be discussing in future videos. These are problems that affect our society as a whole, so it only makes sense that the government, that is, the body we have created and empowered to govern our whole society and represent us and pursue our interests and general welfare, should be doing something about those problems. Particularly problems like mass incarceration, which the government itself is directly responsible for, just kind of seems like the right thing to do, I think participating in the political process is of utmost importance for progressives, because if we don't do that, we won't be able to influence what the priorities of our government are, what policies our government implements, what problems the government commits resources to address. The most basic and important form of participating in our government is to vote. And I think everyone who is eligible to vote should make every effort to do that every time there's an election, from the local level on up to the presidential race every 4 years. But one of the things I think we should vote for is to change the way we vote. Let me explain. Most elections in the U.S., especially those in which there is a single winner, like the presidential election, are conducted using a system called first past the post. In the first past the post system, the candidate with the most votes, after all the votes are counted, is declared the winner. And at first, this seems like the fairest, most obvious system to use. I mean, what could be simpler? The person with the most votes wins. Isn't that the whole point of democracy? Well, sort of. The whole point of democracy is for the government to represent the people. And if elections were always one-on-one contests, the first-past-the-post system would probably be adequate. But when we allow for the possibility of races that include 3 or 4 or more candidates, which we see regularly during presidential primaries, to say nothing of state and local races, which can also routinely include more than 2 candidates, the problems with the first-past-the-post voting system start to become more apparent. For example, let's consider a hypothetical 3-person election. Just for illustration purposes, let's say this was a close election with the votes evenly divided between the 3 candidates. The winning candidate won with 33.5% of the vote. The second-place finisher had 33.3%, and the third-place finisher had 33.2%. That's a pretty close election, right? But the closeness of the result isn't really the point of the example. The point is, while the winner did get more votes than either of the other 2, about 2/3 of the votes cast were for a candidate other than the winner. The winning candidate did not win a majority of the votes, merely a plurality. That being the case, can we really say that this result reflects the will of the people? And some jurisdictions have recognized this problem and have laws mandating that if the winning candidate of an election fails to earn a majority of the votes cast, that is more than 50%, the two candidates with the most votes face each other again in a runoff election. We saw a high-profile example of this just recently with the U.S. Senate elections in the state of Georgia, where both U.S. Senate seats were contested in the general election on November 3rd, and both races ended without a majority winner. So the top two finishers in each race, David Perdue and Jon Ossoff in one, Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock in the other, competed in a runoff election on January 5th. And the Democratic candidates, Ossoff and Warnock, won both runoffs, allowing the Democrats to narrowly take control of the U.S. Senate from Republicans. Thank Christ! Thank you, Jesus Christ! And the voters of Georgia. But this video isn't about partisan politics. Wherever you happen to fall on the political spectrum, whether you're a selfish asshole who ruins everything or more to the left, I think we can all agree that a candidate winning an election without winning a majority of the votes is not an ideal situation. Runoff elections are one way of addressing that situation, and they're fine, but they have problems. For one, they're expensive. The state or county or whatever the relevant jurisdiction has to hold another election a few weeks after the last one. For another, historically speaking, turnout in runoff elections tends to be lower than in the elections that precede them. Even in Georgia on January 5th, where turnout was remarkably high for a runoff election, turnout was still lower than on November 3rd for the general election. So, holding a separate runoff election allows the contested office to go to the candidate who wins a majority of the votes, but it's probably going to be a majority of a smaller number of votes than were cast in the preceding election. The only way to eliminate this problem would be to somehow guarantee that everyone who voted in the first election would also vote in the runoff. But there'd be no way to ensure that every single voter who participated in one election would also participate in another subsequent election. The only way to make sure that the exact same electorate participated in both the original election and the runoff would be to hold both elections at the same time. But the original would have to come first, otherwise how would we know we even needed a runoff in the first place? So the runoff would have to follow the original election, if necessary, automatically, like an instant runoff. That's just silly talk. Unless, okay, so obviously I'm talking about instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting. I mean, it's in the title of the video. Why am I being cute about it? Just an indulgence to entertain myself? Yeah. Ranked choice voting works like this. Instead of voting for one candidate, you can vote for multiple candidates and rank them in the order of your preference. So let's go back to that hypothetical three-person race from earlier. If it was conducted under a ranked choice system rather than first past the post, the ballot might look something like this. If candidate C was your favorite, you'd select them as your first choice. If, say, candidate A wasn't your favorite but was also acceptable to you, you could select them as your second choice. To determine the winner of a ranked choice election, the first choice votes are counted. If a candidate wins more than 50% of the first choice votes, that's it, the election's over. But if no one got a majority of the first choice votes, then the second choice votes would be counted. Let's take the result of our hypothetical first past the post election from earlier and say that was the tally of first choice votes. Candidate A has the most with 33.5%, but that's not enough to win the election because that's not a majority. Because candidate C finished with the fewest number of votes, they are eliminated, and the second choice votes on those ballots are counted. Because you voted for candidate A as your second choice, and your first choice, candidate C, has been eliminated, your vote now counts for candidate A. After the second choice votes for the eliminated candidate have been counted, candidate A has a majority of the votes and is declared the winner. This is a simplified example. In races with 4 or 5 or more candidates, the same process would be repeated, the last place candidate of that round being eliminated and those ballots counted instead for their next ranked choice until someone had a majority of the votes. There are variations within this general framework. Some ranked choice systems allow voters to vote for as many candidates as they want. Some impose a minimum or maximum number of candidates they can vote for, and some require that voters rank every candidate in the race according to their preference. Some systems eliminate the candidate who receives the lowest number of first-place votes, as I described, while others eliminate the candidate with the highest number of last-place votes, or all the candidates who fail to meet a particular threshold. Regardless of the particulars of the method used, the goal is the same. The winner of a ranked choice election is the candidate who receives the majority of the votes, not merely the plurality. And this makes it far less likely that a winning candidate will be perceived as not representing the true will of the voters. I say far less likely because it's still possible, I suppose, for a winning candidate to be perceived as lacking legitimacy under a ranked choice system if they received more second-choice votes than first-choice votes, for example. But I think it's less of a concern than under a first-past-the-post system. Ranked choice voting also allows voters who support a third-party candidate with seemingly no realistic chance of winning to vote as their consciences dictate without having to worry about their candidate acting as a spoiler. You can mark your favorite as your first choice and your preference of the more viable candidates as your second choice. So, let's say you're a member of the Green Party and your candidate is on the ballot but isn't given much of a chance to actually win. You can mark the Green Party candidate as your first choice and the Democratic Party candidate as your second choice. Or the Republican candidate, if you prefer, I guess, but Jesus, you're voting Green and Republican? What kind of chaotic neutral horseshit is that? Are you a trickster imp from the fifth dimension? If so, would you mind reading this out loud for me? Just real quick. Ranked choice voting isn't perfect. No voting system is. In versions of ranked choice voting where voters aren't required to rank every candidate on the ballot, it's possible for all of their candidates to be eliminated before the final round, which means their ballots won't count at all toward the final result. And in systems that do require voters to rank every candidate, the lower rankings can become arbitrary if voters don't have solid preferences. And if those arbitrary votes wind up making the difference, doesn't that undermine the winning candidate's claim to majority support? Also, just because I think ranked choice voting is a better system than first past the post, that doesn't mean that it would guarantee more favorable election results for progressives. We can speculate that it would have in some past elections, the 2000 presidential race, for example, where Ralph Nader was blamed by many for acting as a spoiler and costing Al Gore the election, specifically in the state of Florida. If that had been a ranked choice election and those who selected Nader as their first choice marked Gore as their second choice, we might have been spared the George W. Bush administration. But if the recent Georgia Senate elections had been contested under ranked choice rules, it's likely that at least one and possibly both of the Republican candidates would have won, and the Democrats would not have taken control of the Senate. And that would have sucked. But progressives have lost lots of elections under the first past the post system, and that has sucked too. I don't think we should switch to ranked choice because it will make it easier for our side to win elections. I think we should switch to it because it's a better method that would usually, though perhaps not always, produce a result that better reflected the will of the voters than the current system. Ranked choice voting isn't the only possible alternative to first past the post. There are others, like approval voting, where voters can vote for multiple candidates without ranking them, and whichever candidate receives the most votes is the winner. I prefer ranked choice voting because it enables voters to more clearly express their will and because it's just a more efficient version of what we do now. We have runoff elections already. A ranked choice system would just eliminate the need to hold separate elections for the runoffs. Also, of the various alternatives to first past the post voting that have been proposed over the years, ranked choice is the most widely implemented. It's been used in Australia to elect members of the House of Representatives since 1918. It's used in Ireland. It's seen limited use throughout the United States, perhaps most notably in San Francisco and the state of Maine. The Democratic parties of 4 states, Alaska, Hawaii, Kansas, and Wyoming, used a form of it during their presidential primary elections in 2020, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has used it to select the winner of the Best Picture Oscar since 2009. Having said all that, I think it's important to keep perspective. I do think ranked choice voting is a better way to vote than the first-past-the-post system we currently use most of the time here in the United States. But it's not a cure-all for the problems affecting our electoral system. Implementing ranked choice voting won't fix gerrymandering or voter suppression. It won't restore the Voting Rights Act or return the right to vote to disenfranchised felons. It won't reform our campaign finance laws. There are significant problems with the American electoral system, and those problems won't be solved by choosing a better voting procedure. We need to remember that and continue to push for other necessary changes. Ranked choice voting won't fix everything. It won't fix a lot of things, but it would be an improvement. It would be a step in the right direction. We should take that step and then keep on walking.